Earth, Gilles Suin, Future Earth Secretariat and National Institute for Environmental Studies, Japan. He will be moderating along with Eva Rayner, also from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and Scientific Coordinator of Leibniz Research Network Biodiversity. So this webinar is hosted today by Future Earth, the Leibniz Research Network Biodiversity, and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So once again, we'll hear from each expert, and there will be time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit of information about Future Earth. So we're a global network supporting collaboration between researchers and stakeholders from all different regions, backgrounds, and sectors who are working to generate actionable solutions-oriented knowledge needed to support transformations to sustainability. Our focus is on facilitating research and innovation, building and mobilizing networks, and shaping the global narrative. We do this through various initiatives across our 9 global secretariat hubs all around the world, through our global research networks, our local national committees, and other partners. Future Earth is supporting the 10 must-knows with this webinar to broaden discussion on relevance of science policy on and for biodiversity globally. And we're very proud that there are a number of Future Earth experts who have been invited for the development of both editions of the report so far. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for the kind introduction. And thanks to you, Bridget, and to Gilles, as well as to Future Earth for teaming up today to present the 10 must-knows from Biodiversity Science 2024 in this webinar. My name is Eva Rayner, and I'm the Scientific Coordinator of the Leibniz Research Network Biodiversity. On this slide, you can see the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research's main building. You may have recognized the building in PIC's logo already. PIC is Kirsten, Thonicke's and my home base, and the host institution of Leibniz Biodiversity. The Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research was founded in 1992, so 32 years ago, to advance interdisciplinary climate impact research and to contribute knowledge and solutions for a safe and just climate future. The guiding framework for PIC's research is the integration of the Planetary Boundaries Framework as well as the Global Commons Framework. PIC is a member of the Leibniz Association, which is one of the 4 big science associations in Germany. The Leibniz Association's maxim is Theoria cum praxi, which means that its 96 member institutions support both scientific excellence as well as knowledge transfer to the non-academic world. 18 out of 96 Leibniz institutes founded Leibniz Biodiversity 15 years ago to promote joint research activities and to bundle and support outreach and networking activities of its members. Our 18 research institutes in Leibniz Biodiversity come from the environmental sciences and the humanities, from the social sciences and the life sciences, and they conduct research inter alia on drivers of biodiversity loss, nature restoration, and a multitude of human-environment relationships. Here you can see the map of Germany and where our 18 member institutes are based, a lot of them in the wider Berlin area. Our smallest institute is the Leibniz Center General Linguistics, here, based in Berlin. And our biggest institute is the Senckenberg Natural History Museum, based in Frankfurt, but it has 7 sites all over Germany. 17 out of these 18 members of Leibniz Biodiversity contributed to the 10 must-knows 24. One of them being the Potsdam Institute, Kirsten and myself, and the IGB, Sibylle Schroer is here with us and will present must-know 3 later on. But we're also teamed up with other research institutes and universities outside of Germany, most of them based in Europe, like the University of Zurich. Cornelia Krug is here with us to present must-know 8, but also in Belém, Brazil, where Museu Goeldi is based. Hein van der Voort is with us from there. And from Tokyo, Japan, and from Future Earth, Gilles Zune, who will be moderating the dialogue session later on, also contributed to the Must Knows as a co-author to Must Know 2 on One Health. And having said this, I would like to hand over to Kirsten.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Kirsten Thonicke from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. When we compiled our different activities on the knowledge transfer, while the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was done, we also asked our question, how can actually science support the process now that all the partner countries of the GBF have to either write or update national biodiversity strategies. And we thought we take, next click. We take the GBF different targets and think what can be science-based support on the, provide the decisive knowledge and compiled the 10 must knows from Biodiversity Science in 2024, aiming at the support, to provide the correct science or the important science in support of the German National Biodiversity Network is based in Germany, but we think the method itself can apply to many other conditions and countries. And so we published in 2022 on the next, you can see its heading, the 10 must knows from Biodiversity Science 2022, providing scientific arguments why we need a global biodiversity framework. In its current edition 2024, which you see now, we provided knowledge that support the planned goals for implementing the global biodiversity framework and its individual targets to support the German national biodiversity strategy. And so if you compare both, you find out that our individual must knows have slightly changed, but they center around achieving climate and biodiversity protection together. We do things on forest and agriculture, but today we will guide you through considering undiscovered biodiversity, focus on linking linguistic, cultural, and biological diversity, and releasing transformative change through international collaboration and education for sustainable development. So these individual must knows have the same structure, and on the next slide you see a lot of text, but actually it's just to explain you the structure. So we start with 5 key findings and a key message, and then we explain the background of these the key findings itself. Provide you also with some key numbers, which you might find more intuitive to remember. But we find them also to be very important, and then provide more background to the must know. Each chapter also has a graphic that gives additional information dedicated to the chapter, and we close with recommendations for policymakers and society. Let us dive into the first must know, achieving climate and biodiversity protection together. When we think about climate and biodiversity protection, we think about things protecting ecosystems that have a huge impact on the carbon cycle, yet the climate, but also biodiversity. So where lie the synergies? And one ecosystem type that is widely discussed is the wetlands, and we have, as humanity, have drained loads of wetlands, but now there's a move of restoration and re-wetting those wetlands. And if we now see those climate warming paths, we see that for this strategy, it is really decisive how much we re-wet and when we do, because it's a composite effect of CO2 restoration and also re-establishing natural methane emissions. That is part of the natural process. So if you look at the dark blue line, you will see that if we would start re-wetting all drained wetlands on the globe, we would actually stabilize the warming effect of drained wetlands. If we do that later, this peak is moved towards the end of the century, but the warming level will be higher. If we only re-wet half now or half later, we do not find this plateau. So this is one thing where it's very important to re-wet wetlands because of its carbon storage. But on the other hand, we also must acknowledge, and here another important study has shown is that the biodiversity, and that we see on the next figure, takes at least 3 decades, if not longer, to get close to the hydrological conditions, to the water conditions, to re-establish the chemistry of the soil and to re-establish the vegetation. That's why we think our main finding of this, one of the main findings of this must know is that peatlands are exceptionally well suited to combine biodiversity conservation and climate protection. Looking at Germany, currently drained peatlands used by agriculture can be re-wetted and can still allow sustainable agriculture, known under paludiculture. Still, biodiversity may take several decades, but in a nutshell, it is an advantage for biodiversity, for the water cycle, and also for the carbon. And German agriculture could compensate for all its agricultural emissions. So we can take this as one example of the many possible options that we have to strengthen ecosystems and have positive effects on the climate. And so if we summarize all possible actions, which we see on this figure here, which is the central figure of Must Know 1, we see that if we start looking those actions to protect biodiversity, if we start from the biodiversity action, we find that the majority of those actions have positive effects on mitigating climate change, which we see amounts to 91%, shown here in this green color. And there remain only a few that still have trade-offs or negative effects on climate action. If we think from the climate action side, there are many actions that can have negative effects for biodiversity. And this has to do with actions that often focus on technological aspects. So strengthening nature is really a win. And so our central message for this Must Know is that many actions that conserve biodiversity also have positive effects on climate change mitigation and adaptation, while far fewer actions that protect climate help biodiversity. And this applies to actions that are happening in Germany and in Europe and also to the world. So our recommendations, just to give you an example, and you can see more in the complete 10 Must Knows here. Re-wetting peatlands has clear advantages for water, for climate, water cycling, and biodiversity, because we start turning them from carbon sources to carbon sinks. But also, it is only possible if we set clear re-wetting targets. So we strongly recommend setting clear re-wetting targets and to have it in the EU nature restoration law. And it also has to be substantiated with adequate funding and incentivizing new value chains, because people still live from the land and we need to find compromises with all actors involved in this transition process. And for society, we can say biodiversity conservation supports ecosystem resilience and adaptation, and so helps climate. So local actions to protect biodiversity in the sum can accumulate to climate protection and have a global impact. So we recommend to raise awareness and address concerns in the transformation for protecting, restoring, and also sustainably using wetlands, but also other landscapes and also marine areas by involving all societal actors. And so our take-home message here is for you that the protection and restoration of biodiversity creates synergies with climate mitigation. Resilient nature means good quality of life for us all. But the question now is, how much do we know actually about the biodiversity and nature that we know? And so I would hand over to Sibylle, and she will guide us through considering undiscovered biodiversity. Over to you, Sibylle.
Thank you very much. I'm Sibylle Schroer from Leibniz Institute of Freshwater Ecology and Inland Fisheries. In short, IGB. I'm science coordinator for research on biodiversity and sustainability. And yeah, here we show the graphic of the third must know. A black hole of taxonomy. Taxonomy is the knowledge about the categorization and definition of species. So we symbolize this marginal symbol of taxonomy around a black hole of things we don't know. It's actually approximately 90% of species that we don't know. Next slide, please. So is it that we just do not do the research? Yes, there is hidden biodiversity in neglected spatial and temporal contexts. So we don't see as well in each context. We are a bit biased on the areas that we live in and what we can perceive easier. There are organisms, they are too small for the naked eye. They are beneath the soil or in freshwater. They are in marine environments or invertebrates which are active at night. So here our numbers show a bit insights of this lack of knowledge. In Canada, where a lot of scientists can work with a lot of funding and where freshwater is a highly important topic, they know that 12% of the freshwater species are not known or are endangered. But the important number, about 40%, they cannot say anything about it because they don't know them. Flying insects, they trigger and change a lot of things in our ecosystems. They have a lot of functions for us, like pollinating, like eating cadavers. A lot of things are done by them. They are mainly from 20 families, but we lack knowledge of the categorization and description of these species, which are highly important. And a very recent literature review shows that approximately 59% of all known species are actually active in the soil. Soil is often just something that can be moved, something that can be changed, a bit of dirt, but actually this is the basis of life, soil and sediment and fresh water. Next slide, please. So is this an asking for more research? Yes, we do need more research, especially in the fields where we don't look into that much normally. Soil, sediment, fresh water, marine areas, but also urban spaces, which have a lot of potential for biodiversity. And we need to know more about stresses, such as noise and light at night. But we also know enough. We know enough to act. What was just shown by Kirsten Thonicke. We know that we have to protect and that we need immediate conservation efforts. And consequently, we can improve nature-based climate protection. Next slide, please. So what are the solutions? It is important that we think more on ecosystem-based habitat management, saying the functions, the circulations of areas that are created by different organisms. This is important that we can make this possible, to re-wet, to make them habitats which are livable again, not to focus on single species and single habitat, which is maybe very close to us. We need indicators. So we need to know the status, the level of our measurements, how they are accepted by nature. And especially for stressors like noise and light pollution, existing indicators, they need to be enforced and to be included into area protection targets. There's a lot of new tools like artificial intelligence, like DNA sequencing. There's a lot of ideas. We really need to support this and create a better monitoring with modern tools. But we can monitor as much as we want. If the data is not findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, so fair data principles are important to really use the data for all scientists and to change things or to analyze what is there. And also we need inter and transdisciplinary research. We really need to understand what is the need for human society? What is the need for climate? What is the need for environment? What is the need for infrastructure? We really need to work together, and this is a whole effort, and we really need to support people that can guide different science together and also communicate to policymakers and make them aware and bring them into the boat that we can create a better future together. Next slide, please. So our recommendations for political decision makers is please improve the monitoring. The implementation of nationwide standardized monitoring of biodiversity, like for example, the Darwin Core standard, is necessary because we need to have monitorings that are in the end comparable. We need fair data principles. And we have to be able to reuse the data to discover hidden biodiversity. And then the recommendations for society. Don't wait for your regulations. Everybody can do something. We can be aware of what we are doing. A garden with a lot of wilderness is helping things we can't see. So the reduction of pesticides sometimes is creating a great garden where you don't need to do very much. Less noise, less light pollution. Everybody can step back a bit and maybe consider that the light from my window is shining right out into the next garden or into the living room of someone else who cannot sleep. Mostly it hits birds which cannot close their eyes. So in all areas that we need to protect, everybody can do something, and we don't need to wait for regulations because mostly it's common sense. Next slide, please. So the take-home message is the acceptance that we only know a bit is a major step forward to improve conservation measures. We need to work together and protect what is there. We need research and we need monitoring. And with this, I would give over to a completely different subject, but which is more related than you think with biodiversity. Hein, it's your turn, please.
Turn on the microphone. Yes, thanks, Sibylle. I would like to argue for recognizing a correlation between biodiversity and diversity of languages and cultures. In the text, it says, of the utmost importance to the conservation of indigenous and local knowledge are language maintenance and revitalization programs which support indigenous and local communities, as well as the documentation and analysis of indigenous and local languages as the primary carriers of such knowledge that links to and sustains biodiversity. Well, anyway, on this world, there are about 7,000 known languages. Most of them are highly endangered. We know very little about them. it is estimated that around half of the world's languages is in danger of disappearing during the actual century. However, these languages have built up throughout the ages, throughout the centuries and the millennia. They have accumulated about a local environment where they emerged. And that is especially ecological knowledge, and it's embedded in the languages. Next, please. So in a German context, what does this mean? Well, Germany doesn't have many languages, and as you can see, there are about 8 spoken languages, and they all belong to the same very big Indo-European language family. And in terms of genetics, linguistic genealogy, they all belong to the same tree. And sign language doesn't belong to this family, of course. In comparison, if you look at the southwestern Amazon, it has over 50 languages. And next, please. And the southwestern Amazon is a region about the same size of Germany. If you look at the map, you see there the Guaporé River diagonally through this region. On the north side, you have a part of the Brazilian Amazon. On the south side, you have the Amazonian lowlands of Bolivia, department of Beni. And the numbers refer to the languages. As the list is on the side there, on the right side. There are over 50 languages, and they belong to different language families. The colors already indicated 7 different families are spoken in this region, and then there are even more than 10 isolate languages. Isolates are unique languages. They are not related to any other language or language family that we know. So genealogically, they are unique. And if an example of an isolate language, which may be known by the larger public, is the Basque language of Europe. Now, Europe has only one isolate language. The other languages are all Finno-Ugric or Indo-European. Most of these languages are highly endangered. You can think of languages with 1 speaker left, 5 speakers left, and there are no languages with more than 5,000 speakers in this region. So please go to the next. German, the German language has a high diversity in dialects, as you can see from this map. There are actually 2 languages here, Frisian and German, but highly diversified. And all these dialects, they are so important because they also contain knowledge about the local environment. Please. So what I would like to emphasize is the fact that biological diversity and language diversity as a proxy for cultural diversity overlap. If you look at this map of the world, if you can see them, every black dot represents a language. And the darker colors represent higher plant diversity. This is just one case. And as you can see clearly, the language numbers are highest in those regions where you have highest plant diversity. So please, next. So, as I said, language diversity, biological diversity, cultural diversity, they interact, they are interconnected in some way. We don't understand everything about it, but it is clear that the regions where the ecology is destroyed, as occurs a lot in Brazil, where I live, it's also where the languages are endangered and disappearing, and also in regions where the cultures and languages are not valued. It's also the same region where biodiversity is suffering. So the endangered situation of these diversities are sides of the same coin. Next, please. So we have some recommendation for political decision makers, especially in the ILO 169 convention should be ratified and applied by as many countries as possible, because it's the only convention that really protects the rights and cultures of indigenous peoples and local communities, and therewith biocultural diversity. Next, please. For society, I would like to emphasize, I would like to advocate for the recognition that multilingualism is the way to prevent languages from disappearing. And disappearing languages, you lose a lot of knowledge. And so if you respect and value multilingualism, we know that it is not a problem to learn, for a child to learn 2 languages at the same time. It is a natural process, and human societies are originally have been multilingual anyway. You speak the language of your neighbors, and in that way, you can preserve indigenous languages and its knowledge. Next, please. Takeaway message. So to protect biodiversity, must also protect the territories of the indigenous peoples and local communities and respect their languages and cultures. We have many examples of disrespect of indigenous peoples and local cultures. So I would like to hand over the word to the next speaker.
Yes, thanks very much, Hein. So hello from a multilingual country. So I'm Cornelia Krug, based at the University of Zurich and Switzerland, and I'm going to take a bit of a broader approach because we're going to look at the role of international collaboration and education for sustainable development in releasing transformative change. Next slide, please. So why is it actually important to consider that international context, and why do we need to think about the international collaboration? So this is an example from Switzerland that actually looks at the impacts of biodiversity through consumption and production. So that's the biodiversity footprint of Switzerland. And the footprint actually measures the species lost through land use change. And one thing you can see on the smaller graph is actually that the biodiversity footprint in Switzerland has actually been increasing over the last decade. And it's a lot higher than we actually should be impacting on biodiversity if we're looking at the planetary boundary. But there's also a local and an international context to this as well. You can also see from the larger graph is that actually the impact our consumption and production in Switzerland has inside the country has actually been fairly stable or even decreasing over the last 20 years. In contrast, the impact on biodiversity outside the country's borders have actually been increasing considerably. So at this stage, actually 75% of the impact consumption and production in Switzerland is actually outside the country and not inside. So the impacts that we see on biodiversity, they often seen locally. So we just heard about the changes in the Amazon, but the drivers, they are actually linked globally. And why is this? So a lot of this is actually based on trade and investment. So next slide, please. And Gallas et al., there's a very interesting paper. They actually looked at the impact of finance and financial impact investments on both the Amazon and the boreal forest. Why did they select the Amazon and the boreal forest? Both are actually big ecosystems that are important to maintaining the Earth system's atmosphere. And they're also getting close to a tipping point. So in Amazon, we're moving from rainforest to savanna through deforestation, while in boreal forest, through deforestation, we're moving from forest to degraded forests that can actually sequester less carbon. In the Amazon, it's mostly deforestation through to beef and cattle production, but also soy production. A lot of this is actually then imported into other countries to raise more beef and cattle. While in the boreal forest, the deforestation is mostly due for wood production, pulp production, and new papers. Advance, please. So we know that actually very few companies have market shares in these systems. So it's really highly concentrated. For example, for the case of Amazon beef production, it's 4 firms that actually hold 70% of the investment shares. So these firms really have the power to destabilize the Earth system by actually bringing us closer to the tipping points. But they also, on the reverse side, if they think about if investments are guided and regulated, they actually have the power to actually stabilize the system and move us away from tipping points again. So we actually need to have efforts in place for companies, for business and industry, and financial institutions in particular, to track the impacts on biodiversity along all this value chains and investments. I mean, it's the thing is like these big investment companies, they decide where they actually invest in, what products they actually support. And if there is guidance, they can actually support products or activities that are less impactful on the environment. At the same time, national biodiversity strategies and action plans, they need to include clear guidance for business and finance to internalize those currently external costs of biodiversity. So if you include the cost of a degraded forest, so less carbon sequestered, biodiversity loss, into a company's essentially financial reporting, there will be essentially a loss showing up. So it will be the impact on the environment actually will show up on their books. At the moment, it is hidden and ignored. And we also need more regulations and policies to actually support the implementation of these guidelines. Next slide. But how can we actually move towards this? And a part of this actually relies on the ability and the willingness of, on the one hand, companies, people leading the companies, but also the general public, to have an awareness of the value of biodiversity. Especially for the public, if they have an awareness of the value of biodiversity, actually creates accountability, and they can actually select firms that have less of an impact. Again, these are examples from Switzerland. We see that actually through education, the awareness of biodiversity in a broader society is actually been steadily increasing. So most people by now in Switzerland have heard about the term or have read about the term. About two-thirds to 3/4 of the people who know about the term, they can actually tell you what biodiversity is. So they know what's actually behind this term. There's also an awareness of the status of biodiversity, but what's really interesting, what you can see from the graph below, is that most people, if you ask them in Switzerland, they know that the general status of biodiversity, if you look at it worldwide, it's actually really bad or bad and not very good. So they're aware of the loss of biodiversity and the threat this actually poses to humanity. In contrast, they are actually of the opinion that biodiversity in Switzerland is actually doing fairly well, which actually is opposite what actually the real status of biodiversity is. In Switzerland, no, within Europe, Switzerland is actually doing worst in terms of protection of biodiversity and also status of biodiversity. So we have the highest number of threatened insect and bird species within Europe. So there's a real big gap in like awareness and what actually is the face. And there we actually really need education. It plays a pivotal role in raising awareness of biodiversity, the status of biodiversity in a country. It also helps co-produce knowledge on the status of biodiversity. I'm getting to this a little bit later. And the education for sustainable development is key in contributing and galvanizing behavioral change that then leads to transformative change. And this and also education for sustainable development uses transformative learning approaches across all age and social groups, from kindergarten through primary school, through to tertiary education, but also further and continuing education for adults, and uses a very broad range of different formats. So education of sustainable development needs to be implemented across all levels of education. Next slide, please. And citizen and community science is actually an important component of education for sustainable development. Citizen and community science actually plays a dual role. On the one hand, by working with the public, it actually promotes and deepens an understanding of science, scientific activities, but also an understanding of the scientific methodology in the public. It also helps by involving people in a variety of projects. So I've put up some examples again from the University of Zurich and from ETH. So looking at bees, or monitoring the impacts of climate change. There's also a very interesting citizen science project looking at hidden soil biodiversity that actually has people bury cotton underwear in their gardens, and they're monitoring the decay of the underwear, and that tells them the status of biodiversity in their soils. That's a really fun project. And that way, citizen and community science are an important part of education for sustainable development. On the other hand, running citizen and community science project also supports the science itself. It supports the collection of monitoring data. You have this like army of people outside taking photos, monitoring biodiversity on their walks, on their hikes. A lot of people use different apps like iNaturalist to actually document what's around them. So that actually brings an additional monitoring data that when we do standard monitoring science, we actually can't capture because we don't have the resources to do so. It also builds stronger connections between citizens and scientists because you work together on a project. And it also helps to bring in new sources of information and knowledge for biodiversity research. And what's also, I think, important here to emphasize is that also is an opportunity to bring in indigenous and local knowledge into the biodiversity research. Next slide, please. So our recommendations, some of those are, so one for political decision makers is that we need strong international collaborations that include scientific cooperation and technology transfer. So learning from one country to another. They are the foundations to understand the drivers of biodiversity change, both the direct drivers, but also the indirect drivers underlying them, such as production or consumption. And they also help us to track the effectiveness of targeted actions to conserve biodiversity. And there's some excellent examples in the control of invasive species, for example. A recommendation for society is that we actually really need to think about what are indirect drivers, such as investments in productions, in trade and finer flows. but also our own consumption patterns. How do they contribute to biodiversity loss and climate change? And it's vital that business, industry, and finance track the impacts on biodiversity along the value chain and investments. And to close, next slide. I would just leave you with the take-home message that actually stopping biodiversity loss, which is actually very complex, requires connecting science, policy, economy, and society together. So we need to work together to actually stop it. And we also need to enhance education in a variety of different formats across all age and social groups. And with that, I'm handing back to Eva and Gilles to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cornelia, and thank you all the other really amazing speakers. My personal 4 takeaways: amazing synergies between climate and biodiversity if you are tackling biodiversity in your solution mix. There's a lot of undiscovered biodiversity. There's so many things we don't know, which means that we need to be really humble about what we don't know when we are making decisions. We need to be very careful, have a very anticipatory approach in that. There's major cultural impacts when we are losing biodiversity because of the interconnectedness between biodiversity and culture and language. There's also a lot of knowledge that is being lost when biodiversity, and as a result, culture and language is being lost. And then maybe another really important one to me is really the interconnectedness. Biodiversity does not stop at the border. It's all interconnected, and especially as Cornelia mentioned, the drivers are happening very far away of where impacts are often happening. Of course, it's not with all the situations, but in many cases, that is what is happening today. So we only have a couple of minutes to have a very quick run through of a couple of the questions. We're asking some of the people that are online here that have posted questions within the system. We're trying to address those questions through the chat as we speak. But it would be really interesting to hear a very brief run through from the speakers on what they think is the #1 action that's necessary to really shift towards transformation. And I'm talking about this in line with one of the questions that we received, as in, we know that there's a lot of negative impacts from various anthropogenic activities, for example, agriculture production, but also industry and so forth. We know that these things are happening, but somehow we are continuing to do so. There's a certain path dependency because of the legacy of our interconnected system. So what is really, is it continuation of raising awareness? Is it showing more the impacts that people are having on biodiversity directly? Or is it a mix of better identifying alternative solutions and articulating those solutions? I'd like to pass this to each of the speakers in the same order that they spoke. Just very brief answers if possible. And I'd like you to think about them within the context of the must-know that you presented. So first up, Kirsten, please.
I think my quick answer would be is that we need to talk about the solutions, because there we learn a lot more about the great support biodiversity has for functioning nature, and having a functioning and resilient nature protects climate. And so we create great synergies. Think positive, I think, is the way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Then,
I wanted to go in the same direction, that hope is the best, and then not to give up. To have small targets which can be fulfilled is a guidance to success in there. And we need a structure. We need an interdisciplinary planning that not one side is not knowing what the other does, and that we can go together and create landscapes which are resilient against the threats that we have to face.
Thank you. Hein?
Yes, I think in the same lines, and I would like to say that one of the main concerns should be education of everyone, the general public, starting with the younger generations, because society, as you saw on Cornelia's table, the society as a whole is not really so concerned about biodiversity and doesn't really recognize the consequences of its destruction. So that needs to be fixed. People should become more aware and better educated about the importance of biodiversity and also of cultural diversity, because they are interconnected.
Thank you so much. Cornelia?
Yeah, thank you. So I would actually also argue we need to focus more on like what are the solutions. So provide positive examples and identify exactly those champions within business, industry, but also within agriculture that are actually working already towards improving biodiversity, reducing their impacts on biodiversity, and highlight those much more. And then that goes hand in hand again with what Hein said, is actually then the education, actually make sure that people are aware of these activities and how that actually has a positive impact.
Thank you so much. Those are really insightful. And I'd like to just break the pattern of some of the answers just a little bit. Can you think of, and particularly Cornelia, I hope you can answer this one. Can you think about the differentiation of places where there's already a lot of monitoring in place, and in those places, very specific action is being taken and improvements are being observed, versus places where, for example, there's still a lot of development happening and there's also not a lot of monitoring? How do you balance, in a global scale, the disparities between those negative externalities and the small positive steps forward?
Oh, that really is a tricky one. And I actually have to say, I mean, we here in Switzerland, we've got an excellent biodiversity monitoring system, and we know actually very well what's going on, but we still, yeah, I'm not going to say anything further. But there's actually, I mean, if you think of, I think countries like Colombia, Costa Rica, I mean, Colombia is also leading in terms of biodiversity monitoring. Costa Rica is doing really well in biodiversity restoration. So these examples actually do exist. And I think they just need more attention and more highlights. And also it's like, I think it's also like the Western world really needs to think about their impacts and yeah, and think about the way they're doing things. Yeah.
Thank you so much for really articulating that in a very positive way. And I think that's a great takeaway for our next steps with the report, as we probably want to have a lot of activity on highlighting some of the positive cases that we're seeing in many parts around the world. With that, I'll have to close our panel shortly. And I would like to welcome back Eva for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gilles, and thanks a lot to all the speakers and moderators for this, also for me, very interesting session. As time's commencing, I would like to thank you, the audience, for listening, and we hope that we can engage with you after the webinar as well. What I've learned from the collaboration on the 10 Must Knows 24, as well as on this webinar, is that together we are stronger. And if everyone takes his or her part, then we can manage to make it and to sees the next 6 summers until 2030. The Global Biodiversity Framework, the Biodiversity Plan, as the CBD now calls it, has 23 action targets on the international basis that can be used for that. They now have to be implemented nationally. And I would like to share one last slide and invite all of you to walk this way together. It may be slopey, it may also be steep every now and then, but if we do it together, we can manage to achieve, to restore and protect biodiversity and to live in harmony with nature in 2050. So if you want to connect with us and be part of the plan, that's today's International Day for Biological Biodiversity theme, then either write to me at eva.reiner@picpotsdam.de or scan one of the QR codes, which I'm sharing here. And we will send a wrap-up email after this webinar to all the participants. And thank you so much for all the efforts you do in your contexts, and thank you for listening. Bye.